evening, everyone, and welcome back to another VKC. Today's speaker is Dr. Gregory Dipple, speaking on the topic of carbon capture and storage applied to Kimberlite tailings. Greg received his BSc in geology from Indiana University, his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and his postdoc at Monash University. He has been a professor at UBC for the past 26 years and served as head of the department between 2009 and 2014. Over the past 2 decades, his research interests have migrated from metamorphic processes to shallower magmatic hydrothermal systems, but most recently to carbon sequestration at and near the surface of the Earth. Greg is also the director of BRIM, the Bradshaw Research Initiative for Minerals and Mining at UBC, which promotes cross-disciplinary research addressing the entire life cycle of mining to make the mining sector safer, cleaner, and more efficient. A couple years ago, I was also a student of Greg's, so in my senior year of geology, I was taking Greg's, I think it was aqueous geochemistry, and even though I don't remember much about the course, I do remember teaching Greg a few words in German. For instance, the Freundlich isotherm is not pronounced that way. It is the Freundlich isotherm. So if Greg comes across any German words in this presentation, I hope you can make me proud, Greg. But yeah, in all honesty, in my undergrad, Greg was one of my favorite professors, so please join me in welcoming Greg.
I have no intention of showing any isotherms today. One's like our other. Well, thanks for the opportunity to present an overview of some research we've been chasing for between 10 and 15 years out at UBC. So we've been looking at carbon sequestration in ultramafic mine tailings, and that's work that's evolved over more than a decade, and we really worked on 3 commodity types: diamond, nickel, and asbestos, working in a variety of mines, from abandoned mines to most recently, to active mines. And most recently, the main thrust of this research is through sponsorship from De Beers, is looking at essentially doing baseline studies across all of their mines, their bedrock mines between South Africa, Botswana, and Canada, to get an understanding on whether they might optimally deploy some of this technology to reduce the carbon footprint of their mining operations. So what I thought I would do today is present an overview of essentially some learnings that have really been gathered based on more than a decade of work at a number of mine sites, including all of those commodity types, and then highlight some of the results and opportunities in the Kimberlite space. So there's a number of people that have contributed to this over the years. Sasha Wilson is now a faculty member at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Ian Powers now at Guelph University. Sterling is a current PhD student. Kate Carroll is a former bachelor student now at University of Iceland. And basically the rest of these are former and current graduate students. Anna Harrison is now at Queen's, just out of a faculty position there. Willie Meyer is a hydrogeologist at UBC, geological engineer who's worked with us for more than a decade, and Gordon Sutton was really the other initial instigator of this with me about 14 years ago. He's a geomicrobiologist, and so I will touch on some of the microbial roots as well for some of the applications of this work. So the idea really is to take mine tailings and understand how it can capture CO2 from air and from flue gas, and ultimately store the CO2 in mineral form, where it's essentially sequestered from the atmosphere over geologic timescales, and thus presenting a potential greenhouse gas benefit. There's a lot of co-benefits, and so when I say environmental benefit, leave you with the idea that some mines have the potential to essentially operate net negative greenhouse gas. They can have a net drawdown of CO2 based on their operations. And at the same time, because they're cementing tailings, you can generate potential benefits. And for many of our industry sponsors, these co-benefits are of equal or more importance than sort of carbon tax implications. For example, generating increased stability in tailings, for tailings storage, encapsulating metals, and also reducing dust production in the tailings pile. So I thought I would start by giving a motivation for why we bother doing this. I'm trying to run a live experiment out here, but the sensor keeps shorting. But I have been, I'll show you a film of an experiment that uses this same tailings. And you can see I just restarted this now. I'll explain what's going on the screen, but we can monitor a live example at the front of the room here. So this is essentially the same setup here. So we're essentially using a tablet with windows on it hooked up to a CO2 sensor. These CO2 sensors are manufactured for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, so they're available really inexpensively. They're about $100 a pop from Amazon. They measure CO2 content of air, and they're mostly meant for high efficiency buildings. So they are embedded in the ductwork, and so when the fan runs at a low pace, it measures the CO2 content of the room, and then when that CO2 content gets high enough, they speed the fan up, and that's how they minimize the energy consumption for air circulation. Clearly, UBC Robson is trying to save money because this room has barely, has never been below 1,000 ppm since I came in earlier this evening. So there's pretty high CO2 content in this room already before the room filled up. But I'll show you this, this film here. So this is going to start with just showing you the setup, and then we'll watch what happens to some air that's isolated against tailings. So this is a sensor. This is just an MEC food container filled with some tailings. It's actually the same tailings that are in this one here that the movie uses. So these are fine tailings collected from the tailings storage facility at Gaucho Quay in July 2017. So these are real diamond mine tailings. And what happens with the monitor, then we track the CO2 content in black, the temperature in red, and the relative humidity in green. The important thing is what happens is we isolate a bit of room air against the tailings and see what happens to that isolated bit of room air over time. And we can tell when we've isolated it because the relative humidity starts to spike up because these tailings are partially water saturated. They're about 30% water saturated. So you can see from this graph here, we isolated at about 816. So here's 2 minutes in, we've pulled about 100 ppm of CO2 from the air above those tailings. As we give this 5 or 10 minutes, we'll see that we can extract hundreds of ppm of CO2 directly from the air in the room. So this is the tailings capturing CO2 from air. If we were to do this with flue gas, the rates accelerate about 200-fold. So we have faster capture from flue gas, say 10% CO2, that's untreated flue gas, versus what we can do with air. But you can see we're now getting to the point here, within about 5 minutes in this experiment, we've pulled half of the CO2 from the headspace of room air that was isolated over the tailings in this configuration. And that's really just to emphasize that this idea of CO2 capture happens quickly on human time scales, and it's easily reproducible literally in the room. So that's the motivation, so understanding why that happens, and then how can we take advantage of that on a scale much bigger than reducing the CO2 content of a small headspace like that, and rather think about doing it on a large scale relevant for mine operations. So the reason that the tailings react with air is that in ultramafic hosted mines, such as Kimberlite, or often in serpentinite and ophiolitic rocks, which we have for nickel and asbestos, we are looking at host material that's essentially out of thermodynamic equilibrium with air. So it does spontaneously react with air. And indeed, ultramafic rocks are some of the fastest weathering rocks on Earth because they are reactive to Earth's surface conditions. So when we mine ultramafic rock, including Kimberlite, and grind it up to extract a commodity or a luxury good such as a diamond, we are actually creating a very high reactive surface area of minerals that are out of equilibrium with air. And we can make use of that waste stream then to potentially provide a benefit through carbon capture and storage. And where the CO2 goes is in minerals, and the reason we care about minerals, so this is a diagram from Lackner, it shows essentially the capacity to store CO2 in ultramafic rocks. Virtually unlimited, that's 1 million gigatons of carbon, and it has a times, characteristic storage time of geologic time, hundreds of thousands to millions of years. So the holy grail for carbon capture and storage is to put carbon in minerals, and indeed that's where roughly 90% of carbon on Earth already resides because it is thermodynamically stable. So we're just putting carbon where it wants to be. Normally that happens very slowly, but with mine tailings it happens quickly because we've extracted the material and we've crushed it. So I'm going to touch on 2 points with the talk today. So this shows emissions from fossil fuels in gigatons of CO2 per year over time. This is our current trajectory. We're back up on the red line now based on the more recent data. So these are a whole bunch of computer models, and if we want to basically keep ourselves to less than about 2 degrees C, we need to follow one of these blue paths. And if we want to accept maybe 3 or 4 or 5 degrees global warming, then we can follow one of the other colored paths. So these are basically many, many different computer simulations of climate change as a function of CO2 emissions. The take-home point is that if we're going to avoid 5 degrees of warming, we need to turn this trajectory to flat. And so the first part of the talk will really talk about starting to take individual industrial emitters, such as mining, and turn them greenhouse gas neutral. So that would be part of flattening this curve. But ultimately, by the turn of the century, if we're actually going to avoid significant warming above 2 degrees C, we probably, as a society, have to get net negative. So by 2100, we probably actually have to be pulling CO2 out of air in a net sense. So we're actually pulling more out of the air than we're emitting as a society on a global scale. So this is probably the challenge that our grandchildren will face, or children, depending on how old you are. So at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit, the last part of the talk, I'll look on that time frame for application. So basically when we're reacting the tailings with CO2, it's a pretty simple geochemical model. It really serves to lay down what's going on. Essentially, we're taking a source of carbon dioxide, either from air or from an industrial point source. This could be flue gas from your diesel power station at Gaucho Quay, for example. And we're binding it, we're pairing it with cations that we extract from tailings. And in ultramafic rocks, those are predominantly going to be magnesium. So we use our minerals in the tailings as a source of magnesium. We marry that with the source of CO2, and we precipitate magnesium carbonate minerals. So we need the magnesium, and we need the CO2, and then we can precipitate carbonate minerals under many Earth surface conditions. Relatively straightforward thing to do. This is essentially a transport problem, getting the CO2 to the reaction site, and this is a reaction kinetic problem, getting the minerals to release their magnesium. The take-home point is that field studies now on 8 different mine sites have demonstrated in most natural conditions in mine tailings, the reactions are transport limited. So the rate by which we're pulling CO2 from air in accidental situations in tailings is essentially limited by the rate of diffusion of CO2 in the pore space of the tailings. And so we know that we can overcome that by supplying CO2. So the first part of the talk, I'll give you the evidence for why we believe this is rate limiting. That then provides us, if our problem is supplying CO2, that's a good problem to have if we have industrial sources of CO2. So if we supply CO2, we know we're going to run up against these reaction kinetics limits. So the second part of the application is really how do we optimize where we do this to get the biggest bang for our buck, so the most reactive material. So there's really, from a geochemistry perspective, there's a story about transport, and there's a story about interface or reaction control. And we want to bring those two things together in order to get the optimal outcome. So what I want to leave you with is it can be the amount of carbon that we can sequester in this instance can be significant. It can be easily on the order of what a mine emits. So we can talk about greenhouse gas neutral mining. That's a stated objective for De Beers. It happens now by accident at significant rates. The fastest rate we've seen is at the Mount Keith nickel mine in Western Australia. It's doing 40,000 tons a year, atmospheric CO2, direct air capture, 12% of emissions offset by accident. We know they can double or triple that without changing significantly their operations or their tailings storage facilities. They just look at material handling a little different. These are CO2 limited, so they're transport limited. If we supply CO2, we're going to hit our mineral dissolution limits, and we'll be in this reaction controlled situation. So what we do is we characterize tailings both within a deposit and across deposit to find the most reactive material. We call it the labile component, the labile magnesium. And labile magnesium equates to cheap carbon storage because we can pull the cations off quickly. So in essence, we recognize that the deposits within an individual mine are highly variable. We leverage the inherent geological variability. If we can identify the most reactive material, that's the stuff that we would intercept and then apply to this technology too. And then at the end, I'll talk about what might be feasible with existing mining, some of the co-benefits, and talk about how we might actually do direct air capture for net negative emissions. So that's sort of the outline of the talk. So these are the mines that we have worked at and are currently working at. They're a combination of asbestos, nickel, and diamond mines. The red are either abandoned mines, where we started in the early days, or planned mines, in the case of some of the nickel companies we're working with now. And green are places where we've worked with operating mines. So the green dots are operating mines. So in particular, so we've worked at, early days we worked at Diavik, we're currently working at Gachapue. We've done a baseline study across the Dagir South African deposits. We just started work in Botswana in September. We'll be doing the first field baseline studies in Botswana in June and July. So we're at Arapa and Botswana to look at their operations. And then nickel and asbestos mines in Australia for some of the early studies that we did. So what do we see if we go to these mine sites? We find white crusts. So these are efflorescences of magnesium carbonate. This is at the Clinton Creek Chrysotile mine in the Yukon. Happens in Arctic conditions. This is atmospheric CO2 bound in carbonate minerals. When we make thin sections and we do scanning electron microscope imaging, we can see that the carbonate minerals cement and encapsulate the ground minerals within them. So we know that we're taking milled material from the mining operation and we're cementing it with carbonate minerals, and the amount of cementation can be significant. This is Mount Keith nickel mine in Western Australia. You need a rock hammer to break up that tall surface of cemented tailings. Sometimes when we have point sources of CO2, we find a lot more reaction, so there's quite a bit of carbonate in these crusts. We were very intrigued, trying to figure out what the point source of carbon was at Diavik. And when our hosts came back from their lunch break, they told us this is where they have their treated sewage. So mineralizing the mine sewage. That was after we taste tested for hate. So we got off there pretty quickly. But anyways, we can do the carbon-13 of the carbonate minerals there, and you can actually see the organic 13C signal of essentially carbonated sewage. So Diavik diamond mine, pretty low rate, about 400 tons per year. Tailings storage facility is not set up to optimize for this. The climate is unforgiving. Maybe a situation that's the optimal situation. This is the Mount Keith nickel mine. So that's a 2-kilometer across the cross. This is a tailings storage facility. It's largely uncovered by water so that air can react with the tailings. And they do about 2.5 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year for that tailings facility of that size. That equates to 40,000 tons per year. 100% modern radiocarbon material. So we know that that's CO2 from air, not CO2 from the industrial point sources and from the mined materials. So we use radiocarbon to fingerprint atmospheric CO2. Interestingly, if we take a proper soil gas flux measuring system, instead of $100, this costs $40,000. If we use a system like this, we can measure the CO2 drawdown of nickel tailings in our laboratory environment, and we get 3 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year. So we get virtually identical drawdown rates. This is based on 3 years of a PhD study measuring the abundance of carbonate minerals on 8-year-old surfaces, 7-year-old surfaces, 5-year-old surfaces, 4-year-old surfaces, and drawing basically getting a rate of carbonation from mineral abundance data versus measuring simply changes in concentration of the CO2 in the space. So we know this is a gas diffusion problem here because we're diffusing CO2 down into the surface, and we get the same rate that we get from the mine tailings work. Suggestive that CO2 transport is rate limiting in the natural environment as well. The way we tend to look at rates is by normalizing the tons tailing per year to the amount of tons CO2 per year to tailings production. So mine operations are basically blue. Mine operations are basically crushing and extracting and crushing rock. So mine emissions, oh, you know what it is? It's this. It's being overprinted by this thing.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
So CO2 emissions scale with the size of the mine. Since 90 to 99%, unless you're a coal mine or an iron mine, most of the rock you extract is waste. So essentially, your emissions typically track quite nicely with the size of your tailings stream. Since the tailings are used to sequester carbon, it's useful to normalize the data in this way. And we can see that for different mine sites, that these rates that are happening, this is purely accidental carbonation that's happening in tailings. It's typically at least a solid order of magnitude off of mine emissions. But importantly, the actual capacity of ultramafic host rocks to sequester CO2 is another order of magnitude higher. So if we can do roughly 10% reaction of our tailings, we have a greenhouse gas neutral mine. It depends on the size of the mine and where the power comes from, whether it's on-grid with a green source of energy, for example, that reduces your carbon footprint. So we can play with some of the mine design issues. But the point is, reaction of about 10% tailings typically is sufficient to offset all the mine emissions. So if we want a greenhouse gas neutral mine, we need to do about 10% reaction. And we'll get there to GHG neutral. And we're putting the carbon in carbonate minerals. This is what we would like to make, magnesite and hydrous magnesium carbonate. This is the mineral that's actually the most stable thermodynamic state for magnesium carbonate under Earth's surface conditions. But because of the strong solvation sphere around magnesium when it's in solution, we typically make hydrated magnesium carbonate minerals, and hydromagnesite, espihonite, and dippingite are all the examples of the minerals that we actually find forming in the tailings. So we make these hydrated magnesium carbonate minerals under Earth's surface conditions typically. And they're the minerals that are doing the cementation. And there's some good benefits that can be played by getting an optimal ratio of magnesium to CO2 by tweaking which minerals you might form. And that depends on humidity and things like that. So we can play those games, but those are very much second order games. When we walk into a mine site, essentially we use a 3-isotope system to understand the different sources of carbon. So radiocarbon, 13C and 18O. We understand mineral abundances by using quantitative X-ray diffraction, because the minerals that host the atmospheric CO2, dippingite, hydromagnesite, and espihonite, those minerals don't exist in the tailings to begin with. So if we do a bulk CO2 analysis, we might be including some carbonate alteration that exists within the ore deposit. So we actually identify the carbon budgets using mineralogical data, not just bulk chemical data. We can then calibrate reactive transport models from experiments and field data, and then this gives us a framework in which to make predictions about how to set up acceleration within a specific mine site in order to get an optimal outcome. So we use experimental and field data to calibrate reactive transport models to allow us to make proposals on what to do. So there's a whole bunch of evidence to demonstrate that the carbonation rates that we see in the laboratory and that we see in field studies are limited by CO2 supply. One most obvious one is every mine site we're working at, we bury labile magnesium before it's fully reacted, and you can find it, and we have no measurable CO2 in the pore gas within the first half meter or so. So there's no CO2 getting to depth of the tailings, but there's minerals that are highly reactive. We have labile magnesium and it gets buried. When we are CO2 starved, there's actually a kinetic 13C signature that's quite distinctive. We can reproduce that in the lab, and we see that same carbon-13 kinetic fractionation in the carbonate minerals that are forming in tailings piles naturally in active mine sites. When we run experiments like this, we find that the drawdown rates are independent of the amount of reactive material. So if we triple the amount of reactive magnesium in these tailings, we get the same drawdown rate. And the reason for that is it's transport limited. The rate is controlled by the diffusion of CO2, not by the reaction at the interface. If you had 3 times as much interface, you'd expect the reaction rate would triple if you had more labile magnesium in that material. If we take these materials and roughen them, basically till the surface of tailings, we can double the uptake rate. Because we have essentially more exposed surface in direct contact with air. And when we run injection into sort of meter-sized columns of tailings to look at how flue gas might react, we can basically, our rates are essentially the rate of carbon, we're supplying carbon at the base of the column. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we can enhance delivery of CO2, and that will then allow us to accelerate things, and we'll accelerate to the point of mineral reaction. So I'll show you a little bit of evidence for these limits, and then talk about how do we optimize our process to treat the most reactive tailings. So this is an example from the Mount Keith nickel mine. So we can trench down into the tailings, and basically in this case one of the reactive minerals is brucite, which is magnesium hydroxide. This is actually 1.5 meter depth. I lost the distance on this, but we see we have brucite content. It's gone at the surface. This is an old tailings flow, so brucite's been fully reacted at the surface, but we've buried a whole bunch of reactive minerals at depth. So we know that we've buried labile magnesium. We could have reacted these things further. Okay, so we'll talk So we'll talk a little bit on how we can accelerate CO2 supply rates, and then that'll focus us on optimizing reactivity rates. And there is a parallel part of the approach here is we don't have a single technology that we will use. You know, the rates that the capacity to do this in mines depend on how the tailings storage facility is designed, depends on the nature of the mineralogy and the geology of the deposit itself, and it depends on the climate. And so we have a range of approaches, and we want to optimize the approach based on the specific situation at the mine site that we're working. Given that we work from Western Australia to South Africa to the Canadian Arctic, we have a wide range of operational and climate conditions we have to work with. And obviously one efficient way of effectively sequestering carbon is biological routes. So Gordon Southam is a geomicrobiologist. He's led sort of the biological side, and this slide is just meant to emphasize that we can use photosynthesis to accelerate CO2 supply. We can use organic acids to accelerate mineral reaction, and we can use generation of alkalinity on cell walls to accelerate precipitation. So we have this geochemical framework, but biology can impact all of those same processes. And so there's essentially a completely parallel system that uses biology. Depending on the problem at hand, you may want to use one of these solutions to accelerate reactivity. So essentially we have a system essentially where we have amount of offset versus how much we're willing to spend for carbon. And we see a whole series of approaches that depend on, obviously the more you spend, the more offset you're going to get. But there's a series of different approaches that you might apply, depending on whether or not you're working in the tens of dollars per ton range to the hundreds of dollars per ton. And right now all of our work is focused on the tens of dollars per ton range, essentially equivalent to right now BC $35 a ton, $35 Canadian is your carbon tax. Two important things to take away from this slide: multiple approaches, but more importantly, we don't stop at 100%. So this is a net greenhouse gas neutral. This is greenhouse gas neutral. This is a net negative mine, and we don't intersect the origin. Every mine we've looked at is carbonating to some degree. In some cases, a trivial rate. Diavik, maybe 400 tons per year. That would be 50 round trip flights to Johannesburg for one individual. So 400 tons per year, Diavik, 40,000 tons per year at Mount Keith. So very different rates, but it is happening. So we use a lot of different tools to understand how to accelerate things. We do microfluidics experiments. We can inject gas into essentially glass slides, and we make movies on the microscope. So we can understand gas and pore water interactions. We understand mineral kinetics with stirred flask experiments, and then we do small scale, decimeter scale, and then meter scale injection columns to get rates and controls, and use these to calibrate our reactive transport models, and ultimately we use these reactive transport models to make predictions of how things may operate in the mine site. And just to illustrate that, this is taking one reactive transport model, calibrated against column experiments in the lab and the data from the Mount Keith nickel mine. And in this case, we've taken the Mount Keith nickel mine now, and we've moved it from Western Australia to South Africa to Finland to Quebec. And the difference in the uptake rate here is all the climate. So this reactive transport model is essentially a bathtub filled with sand, filled with water. We're evaporating the water out. We impose a climate cycle on it. We use, we track temperature, latent heat, crystallization, and evaporation. We have all the sensible heat. We have advection, diffusion and advection of gas, liquid transport, mineral dissolution, precipitation, kinetics, all embedded within here. And then we can make these sort of predictions on how this, just as to illustrate being control, everything else being constant, this is the control of climate on the passive rates of carbon fixation that would happen. We can now apply this to a situation where we would inject the flue gas, and we can look at least some predictions on how that might accelerate things. So there's a lot of different ways that we can drive acceleration. We can lay down our tailings flows as thinner flows so they react before they get buried. We can use point sources of CO2. We can accelerate, we can use geomicrobiology to accelerate things. We can, if we have a point source of CO2, we can run our, if we're in a nickel mine, maybe we can use flue gas to run our flotation cell. We can co-inject flue gas in our pipeline, tailings pipeline. This is a 20-minute residence time in the tailings pipeline. At Mount Keith, for example, so we have essentially a nice turbulent flow reactor we can use, or we could inject CO2 into the tailings pipeline. So there's a bunch of different ways you might use to supply CO2. We can use catalysts to accelerate the absorption of CO2, the hydration of CO2 in water. So for Mount Keith, for example, essentially this is what's currently happening. We could essentially, they're burying about half their labile magnesium. If they put down tailings flows that were about 10 centimeters thick rather than 50 centimeters thick, they could essentially react all that labile magnesium before they bury it. So they would double their CO2 sequestration rate simply by putting down thinner flows of tailings. You could do that by increasing the tailings storage footprint, but you could also do it by simply turning on the tailings distribution spigots more frequently. So right now they have 5 risers, and they will run 2 until the flows they get a certain taper in the tailings pile, and then they'll turn those off and they'll turn other ones on. They could create thinner flows by simply turning those caps on and off more quickly and generate, essentially, increase their uptake rate without redesigning their tailings storage facility, really just changing their operations. More extreme example, this is the master's thesis work of Janine McCutcheon. She basically made a 10-meter wetlands. So this is basically synthetic mine leach water populated with algal mats from Atlan, BC, which is an area of natural weathering of ultramafic rocks. And essentially, by using this synthetic wetlands, she was taking these solutions and got a carbon sequestration rate of 24 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared per year. Remember, the rate at Mount Keith is 2.4. So this is a 10-fold acceleration of the CO2 uptake rate, in this case by using photosynthetic algal mats. Only about 1/3 of that goes into minerals, 2/3 goes into biomass, but then there's the potential biofuels, or is there potential value in the biomass that you're making. So this would be an example where you'd accelerate your CO2 uptake by using biology. And Anna Harrison, in her PhD, she showed how we can get essentially about a 200-fold acceleration using flue gas over air, and if we have pure CO2, we get about 2,000-fold acceleration of CO2 reaction rates by using concentrated sources of CO2. So there's a whole bunch of ways that we can get past this obstacle. So what our work now is really focused on, if we're going to do something, if we're going to take one of these scenarios and deploy it, we want to deploy it to the most reactive materials. And how do we understand what's the most reactive materials? So to do that, we use a custom-built mineral reactor. So this is essentially we have an eluent that is pumped through a sample of tailings. We measure the pH before and after, and then we auto-collect that solution at the tail end and measure the cation abundance, so we can get mineral dissolution rates. We can measure them in this system. It's a highly tunable system, so we can vary the reactive parameters by about 2,000-fold in this system by changing the size of the flow rate, thickness of the tubing, dial of the pump to change how much tailings are reacting. But the important thing here is we're measuring the reactivity of tailings. We're doing this at room temperature and pressure. We use distilled water that has 10% CO2 flowing through it, sparged through it. So we're using no special chemicals, and we're using flue gas CO2 concentrations as a source of acidity. That acidity then drives mineral dissolution, and we generally stop counting after 2 days. So essentially, we're measuring how much magnesium can we get off of tailings at room temperature and pressure with no special chemistry, using only flue gas for acidity, and stopping after 2 days. And for us, that's the $10 a ton carbon approach. If we have to do a lot bigger interventions beyond that, we're talking about carbon sequestration that will probably cost more than tens of dollars per ton if we're going to try and implement that at scale. So that's what the system looks like. It's very messy, but basically here's where the pH sensors are. This is where the tailings sample sits. This is the pump. This is the eluent bottle here. And then basically the exhaust, the spent solution, we use an auto sampler in reverse, and it just automatically fills up the tubes every so many minutes, and the graduate student just has to go in and put tops on the vials and analyze the samples for the magnesium concentration. So it's a fully automated system, and the data that we get looks something like this. So this is magnesium concentration in that effluent. This is in parts per billion, so think of this as ppm. We're looking now, there's sort of 2 days to 3 days reaction time. And so we're looking at, this is the inlet pH, and this is the outlet pH. That pH shift, the amount of pH buffering we get, is actually proportional to the amount of cation extraction. But we measure the magnesium concentrations coming out. And we typically have an early period of fast magnesium release, and then we tail back down to these background rates. So if we plot that up, since this is a constant flow rate, this corresponds to a high reaction rate, and this corresponds to a slow reaction rate. So if we plot that in terms of CO2 equivalent in reaction rate, this is the same experimental data. We essentially have a couple of order of magnitude drop in reaction rate from the early period to the late period. These reaction rates are the textbook reaction rates that you get from mineral dissolution kinetics in a geochemistry textbook. This is far from equilibrium, bulk stoichiometric mineral dissolution. But what we find is that a significant fraction of the magnesium for this sample, about 8% of the total magnesium content of this sample, is extracted under this rapid regime here before we tail off down to the slow regime. So a significant amount of the magnesium is actually extractable on this time frame of a day or two under these conditions. And so the key is understanding what controls that. It's basically controlled by trace mineral abundance. So we have things like hydrotalcites and brucite and other minerals that are inherently very fast reacting. And 2% brucite can be enough to make a mine greenhouse gas neutral, depending on power source for the mine. So small amounts of trace minerals can make a huge impact. But in addition, we actually find that the matrosilicate minerals have properties that release magnesium quickly as well. And you can see that if we do pH jump experiments. So this is part of James Tom's work that he did towards the PhD. We essentially are looking at, these are now magnesium concentrations in a flow-through reactor. And starting with 1 pH, if we go through a pH jump, see we have a transient. We do a pH jump, we get another transient in magnesium. This is in the same material running continuously. So after several hundred hours of reaction, if we just change the inlet pH, we get a transient increase in magnesium release that's equivalent to this fast release. So some of this fast release magnesium is surface processes on silicate minerals, especially clays and serpentine, which have a high intrinsic surface area. So they can, even if you're only reacting 1 or 2 layers of the mineral, it can actually affect a significant amount of the magnesium budget because the surface area of these minerals is so high, especially when they've been crushed. So you can think of it, when we do this measurement, we find some materials have less than 1% labile magnesium. We get labile magnesium contents of 14–15% in some materials, all within a single deposit. So obviously we want to work on the material that has a high labile magnesium content, but even though this is an automated system, we can't run this experiment on thousands of samples in order to get an understanding of an individual ore body, let alone a bunch of ore bodies. So, but we have a mineralogical understanding of what imparts this labile magnesium. It's mineral abundance, especially trace minerals, and surface reactivity and surface area. So this is an example where we've adopted that assumption, made some chemical and physical measurements on tailings, and actually calculated the labile magnesium versus the labile magnesium content measured in that flow-through reactor. And you can see for a first-order cut, we can actually, by knowing the mineralogy of the material and the surface area and things like that, we can calculate labile magnesium reasonably accurately. That's still hard work. So, and Maddie's left us. So it's hard to do a QXRD. So quantitative X-ray diffraction data to get those mineralogical abundance. So this is work that Sterling Battersby is doing for his thesis. Here we've calculated the labile magnesium from the quantitative X-ray diffraction data. So this axis is equivalent to this axis. Now here we've calculated it from exploration geochemistry from a nickel mine. So we've essentially done a basis transformation and used the bulk, magnesium silicon, loss on ignition, bulk chemical data from a 10,000 sample exploration geochemical database and calculated the labile magnesium from all that exploration data. And this is based on the blue here were the samples that were used to build the geochemical model to do that, and then there's 20 validation samples. The 20 black dots were 20 additional samples that we ran the model on, but we didn't tune the model to reproduce them. So they're sort of the validation sample speed. 10 to build the model to calibrate, and 20 to validate. So we can then apply that to the exploration geochemical database. So now this is Baptiste nickel deposit in central BC, calculated labile magnesium content from a drill core, extrapolated into the whole ore body, about 1 billion ton low-grade nickel deposit. So we now have millions of tons of ore at various labile magnesium contents. The important thing to take away, there's a long tail out here, and we still have an average, but we have a significant amount of material that has a high labile magnesium content. So we can start at this end and say, let's just start reacting the most reactive and stop when the mine is greenhouse gas neutral. And if we do that, we get about 29%. So if we intercepted the 29% of most reactive, 29% of the tailings, and focused on the most reactive tailings, this mine could be greenhouse gas neutral at 29% reactivity. If we go beyond that, react more tailings than that 30%, we would have a net negative greenhouse gas mine operations. So this is to illustrate this idea of going to greenhouse gas neutral or net negative. This just uses the labile magnesium, and in this case, we don't even have to intercept all of the tailings. But these geochemical data, they're from exploration, they actually have a spatial component as well. So we can actually build a three-dimensional model of the labile magnesium content of the ore body and build that into mine planning there. And we can recognize areas of the deposit that have high labile magnesium content near the surface. This is stuff that could be captured in the early stages of mining and then used for, essentially treated with CO2 and used for other purposes. In this case, the primary motivation for FPX Nickel, which is the company that has this deposit, is that they want to use this to buttress their tailings dams to enhance the security and stability of their tailings storage. I'll show you some more data on that in a minute. So we've started doing similar studies for De Beers, looking at some of their different mines, and this is in a paper that came out of the last Kimberlite conference, but essentially looking at how much material would we have to react to achieve essentially 100% offsets. Again, it's on the order of 10% of the material if you fully reacted it. This is not the labile magnesium content, this is the total magnesium content. But this is just to illustrate that Kimberlite has these same properties. And we can look at this on a mine-by-mine basis in terms of the emissions of the mine and also the amount of material that's mined. The mineralogy of these mines is very different. And so one of the big learnings in our first year of work with De Beers was to kind of come out summarized in this ternary diagram, sort of a framework in which to try and think about how reactive Kimberlite is to CO2. And walking into this, we had one data point, Diavik. And that was kind of like a nickel mine from our perspective. It was serpentine rich and it was reactive and all was good. And then we started looking at Victor and Snap Lake and Venetia. And there's Victor, there's 30% dilution by sedimentary carbonate rocks. There's Victor in their tailings. You can see that in the tables. So you've got a very, very large CO2 release risk if you start messing with those tailings, because a third of your tailings are carbonate minerals. And if they release the CO2 that's bound to the calcite, it's going to be really hard to overcome that. So probably you would walk away from kimberlites that fall along in towards this axis here. The shallow facies at Venetia, and so we see probably something similar, all the crater facies that are up on stuff, very, very clay-rich material, not really amenable to the approaches that we've taken to date, but we are looking at sort of cation exchange approaches that we might be able to use to get CO2 sequestration capacity out of clay-rich material, but it's nasty stuff. Gaucho clay and the future of Venetia, which is into much darker DDK, dark volcanoclastic kimberlite, moves us down towards this axis here. So what we are seeing is in the mine operations, as they go deeper into the darker and fresher material, we're seeing clearly they're moving in that direction at Orapa and Zhuanang and Venetia and at Gaucho Quay. These are actually from the very first year of operations, just that weathered cap, and already their material is moving down towards this axis. These are serpentine and brucite and hydrotalcite bearing tailings that are amenable to sort of the traditional approach that we've applied today. But we walked into this thinking that kimberlite plotted here, and it was a big eye-opener in our first year to get an appreciation for the diversity within individual deposits as well as between them. So to finish up, I'll just show you a couple benefits from carbon sequestration and then talk for just a minute on where this might go in the long term. But that's really lays the groundwork on how you might make a greenhouse gas neutral mine. But the primary motivation in many cases is not just greenhouse gas neutrality. So this is cemented nickel tailings from the Baptiste deposit that Sterling Vandersee is working on for his PhD. So we take tailings and we expose them to 10% CO2 at room temperature and pressure for 3, 5, 7 weeks. We look at this axis here is effectively labile magnesium. The higher the labile magnesium, the longer it takes to this material penetrate deeper into the sample. We get more CO2, and we get an unconfined compressive strength in excess of what would come out of your Lafarge truck if you were pouring directly So we get cemented tailings that has essentially an unconfined compressive strength, in some cases in excess, essentially approaching high-strength construction cement. And so this is the material, so this is tailings from Baptiste, and the primary motivation for that company is can they develop a hybrid dry stacking approach that would reduce their cost for tailings storage and buttress the tailings dam so they have a more secure tailings storage facility as part of their mine operations. The primary benefit for them was a reduction in the original capital expenditures to open the mine, not necessarily a reduction in the operational expenditures. But we would calculate they're probably going to be paying about $3 million a year in carbon tax based on the BC carbon tax. This is work that Sasha Wilson and her students did. This looks at, so this is reactions that have happened in the tailings pile where serpentine has been partly carbonated. So you essentially have hydromagnesite replacing serpentine, and this here really just shows 3 spots in here and the relative movement on this scale. Here's the iron, chrome, cobalt, manganese, and nickel abundance. And the important thing to show here is we're going from silicate to carbonate. The manganese, the nickel, the cobalt, and the chromium contents are constant. We're replacing these minerals and encapsulating the toxic metals in the carbonate that replaces them. So these carbonate minerals that form have the capacity to encapsulate and essentially sequester potentially toxic metals as well as CO2 if we have reactions within tailings mines. And the obviously when you see this cemented surfaces like I've shown in previous photos, you can imagine dust on productions can be greatly reduced. So to end, just a couple slides talking on how we might look, how mining might contribute towards achieving outcomes at this end of the scale. And so this is based on a leap of faith. So we have one ore deposit where we've actually been able to estimate how the labile magnesium across a large deposit, so 1 billion tons. What if this distribution of labile magnesium applied to the distribution of ultramafic rocks in the top kilometer of the continental crust on Earth? Then this tail would correspond to the capacity to store hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 because of the abundance of ultramafic rocks on the surface of the Earth. So you only need to find that couple percent that has high labile magnesium, and that could generate large amounts of carbon sequestration. That's on a scale much larger than current mining with these types of rocks. But we can at least see if what would that entail in terms of trying to pay for it. So this is, if you imagine you have now, instead of this being a deposit, you have individual deposits that have average contents that correspond to a certain labile magnesium content. You would take that average labile magnesium content, and if you read off the green line, this is now a ratio of CO2 mineralized to emitted. So the first you get to 1, you've made the mine greenhouse gas neutral. If you double that, now you've essentially sequestered as much CO2, you've made your mine CO2 neutral and sequestered another equivalent amount of CO2 in the tailings. And so then you can, if you assume a $10 a ton open pit cost for mining, you can calculate what would the carbon tax have to be to pay for mine operations from the carbon tax. And that goes to infinity as you approach 1, because you offset all of your mine emissions first before you can take a penny from the carbon tax. So this says when you get out into these regimes up in here, you're up into the, this is now, you're paying for your entire mine operations with the carbon tax. There's no commodity or no luxury good that you're extracting from the mine as part of the process. So it gets you into, it's hard to get beyond hundreds of dollars per ton. And it seems ridiculous to potentially to apply this to the crust. We haven't currently mapped the crust for labile magnesium, but the Dumont nickel mine in Quebec has a reported average labile magnesium content that lies in here somewhere, and that's about 1 billion ton deposit. So there are reports at least of large scale deposits that have that bulk average labile magnesium contents that correspond to this amount. So it's maybe not too crazy to think that these things might actually be usable for this purpose. So this just takes that a step further and says, let's give ourselves a bit of a break. So this blue line here is essentially the green numbers on the previous slide. Well, if we assume that the mine is on grid, and so they can use essentially electricity for running their mills, etc., and then that energy is renewable energy, then that reduces the carbon footprint of the mine by about 50%. This would apply to Baptiste deposit, which will be on grid and uses hydroelectricity in BC. This would apply to Dumont, which is in Quebec, where the grid is 90+% hydroelectric. So this is not building fantasy windmills and solar panels in the future. This would apply, for example, to Quebec and British Columbia today, if they're on grid. If you further assume that you recover half of your mining cost by sub-economic commodity, in this case this is based on recovering $5 a ton of your mining cost from nickel. So you're taking a sub-economic mineral deposit and you're topping it up with the carbon tax. You can see if we're out in this regime out here, we're now getting down into the tens of dollars per ton. So there potentially are places now where you have large deposits, if they have this labile magnesium content, they're sub-economic, like Dumont is currently for nickel. Carbon tax of about $30 a ton might actually be enough to supplement the cost, supplement the expense of mining such that you could run a mine at break even, and about half of your income would actually be derived from net negative carbon emissions. So this is after the mine's neutral. You get paid for anything you've done above and beyond that, and it might be able to contribute towards the actual cost of running the mine. So this is, nobody has air capture at $10 a ton today, right? The technologies that are being talked about for achieving net negative CO2 emissions are things like carbon engineering and Squamish. They're in the hundreds of dollars per ton. They capture CO2 from air. They're hoping to make jet fuel from it. But that's hundreds and hundreds of dollars per ton. Even the approaches like BECCS, which is essentially using bioenergy and afforestation together with carbon capture and storage, which itself is a $100 a ton technology, also is a way to go net negative. But again, it's up in the hundreds of dollars per ton. So there's nothing on the landscape right now for society to achieve net negative emissions on this scale at a cost of tens of dollars per ton. This would suggest that it might be feasible with mining. To do that, we're going to dramatically increase the scale of mining. And it's a fair question to ask if that's the planet we want to live on. So I've just calculated, if we optimize a mine for carbon sequestration, so we want to do a net negative of 1 million tons per year. This is the footprint of that carbon engineering have stated for their system. They need their system to be spread out. They can't have all their air captured together because there's no CO2 left in the air if you have two units next to each other. So they have a significant footprint. Think of it as like a windmill field, if you like. The BECCS type approaches that want to use biology for net negative emissions, they're talking about turning croplands into forests, for example. And that footprint lies up into here for 1 million tons per year. Back of the envelope, if we can overcome CO2 supply and use that labile magnesium reaction rate, we can do 1 million ton per year net negative in a mine with a footprint on the order of a few tens of square kilometers. So it's an order of magnitude larger than direct air capture, and more than an order of magnitude smaller than loss of cropland through something like afforestation or cutbacks. So this is not, this is a dramatic increase in the scale of mining on the planet if we want to actually start impacting the carbon cycle. But any solution that we're looking at to achieve net negative emissions is going to create an industry that operates on the scale of the fossil fuel industry, because that's the cause of the problem that we're facing. And the footprint of the fossil fuel industry globally is obviously huge. Whatever we do is going to have a footprint of that size in the future. So this is not meant to suggest that the solution is mining, but perhaps we should start to try these things, see if we can make it work, and use those learnings to maybe ultimately, in some instances, this approach can be one of the things that contribute towards trying to pull us towards net negative emissions. All right, so to summarize, basically it can happen at a significant scale now. It's transport limited. We have a framework in which to identify which materials to intervene with, and we recognize that it's highly variable within individual geologic deposits. And for us to get the biggest bang for our buck, we want to actually not only recognize, but we want to embrace the geological variability in these deposits so that we react the most reactive material. We can probably do 10 or so million tons per year at the scale of the planet based on existing mining in ultramafic rock-hosted commodities and luxury goods. There's co-benefits that are often the primary motivator in mining companies today. And ultimately, this technology may have an approach towards helping us achieve net negative emissions at the sub $100 per ton level in the next century.
Any questions? Yes, I have a question for you, Greg. So it sounds like the mine tailings themselves for these ultramafic deposits are going to become sort of a commodity on their own. So you have a mine that's not ultramafic in nature. Could they just import tailings from one of these kimberlite mines to just achieve carbon neutral status?
Yeah, there's moving tailings is probably energetically not that feasible. It's easier to move gas, probably. So probably you'll pipeline your CO2 where you're probably easier to move gas to the tailings rather than move the tailings to the gas. And the easiest thing to do is to let the atmosphere do it for you and focus on direct air capture. So the easiest way to offset emissions in one place would be through direct air capture at the site of where you have ultramafic tailings without having to move them. That certainly would keep the cost down. Pipelining CO2, usually the economics of that fail after about 200 kilometers, and that's $50 a ton, and CO2 has to be purified because you don't want 10% CO2, and then 90% of what you're moving is nitrogen. Right? You want to move pure CO2 if you're going to move gas, and it has to be dehydrated and clean because humid CO2 is very corrosive, so probably would ruin the integrity of your pipeline. There's a whole bunch of reasons why even moving gas is difficult. So I can see in very specialized instances you might move highly reactive material, but at a large scale you probably rely on capture from air. You can offset your emissions in one place by direct air capture somewhere else. The way a mine will make itself greenhouse gas neutral is it's not going to put tailings in the exhaust pipes of its trucks. It's just going to use the tailings to pull the CO2 from the air, and the trucks will continue to get into the air. Even on the scale of a mine, you're going to use that. You're just going to pull it in where the tailings is. Move the tailings around. We focused exclusively on active mines because I think it would be hard to take. There's 2 billion tons of ultramafic mine tailings in Canada alone, right? Southern Quebec, asbestos. Beginning southern Quebec has 2 billion tons of serpentine-rich waste rock and tailings that are carbonated today. No measurable CO2 in the poor gas of those tailings piles. It's George Woodlands group has been working there for years. So there's a great area there to do things, but to actually do something, you now have to create an industrial process. So we think that working with operating mines is actually critical because you already have the existing infrastructure. You're probably going to be able to get the benefit at a much smaller marginal cost and energy penalty by piggybacking onto existing operations and trying to build new operations from scratch. But if carbon goes up to $100 a ton, then it probably would be feasible to start to stake these old tailings piles.
I guess at that point,
carbon capture.
It's probably feasible to mine all the ophiolite at the surface.
That's basically what this graph is, right? So probably it would be hard to do it for less than $100 a ton unless you can pull something out. But this $10 a ton cost for an open pit mine, that includes all the mineral processing, right? That's like a textbook number for the base mining cost. So that includes mineral processing. So you would have the ability to cover something like that.
Greg, can you just go back to your last slide, the third bullet? If the CO2 supply is 10% at flue gas, when will you hit that mineral dissolution limit in a column in terms of time?
So it depends on flow rate and labile magnesium content and preferential flow paths and things like that. But certainly we've done meter scale columns of, not of tailings, but basically mixing. We've used quartz sand as inert framework and mixed in minerals that have labile magnesium at modest levels. And we pumped 10% CO2 into the base at 250 milliliters per minute. And there was no detectable CO2 at the top for over 100 hours. All the CO2 that was pumped into the base of that column over 100 hours, none of it was all mineralized, and none of it escaped until at the beginning of the breakthrough curve, and the CO2 started to leave at the top as the reaction front was coming up the top of that column. If the column were 2 meters high, that would be 200 hours. If that same column, when that same column has 60% pore saturation, it comes through faster because now you create pipeline. You have so much water present that the gas channels into little into chimneys. And those chimneys then mean that a lot of the tailings don't react. So, and if you have too little water, you don't get any reaction because we need water for the reactions. Maintaining water content is also another. So reactivity of the tailings, water content, permeability, flow rate will all affect that. But to go 100 hours with no detectable CO2 at the top and was significant. And all that CO2 ended up in minerals. So we measured the carbonation rate. The whole experiment ran on its balance. So we could actually measure the carbonation rate by watching the weight of the column increase over the 100 hours and adding enough CO2 that the mass of the column is increasing. But we also measure the CO2 flux because we know the gas flux in. And then we measured the carbonate abundance in the minerals all through the material at the end. And they all matched at the end. They all gave essentially the same number. So that CO2 was mineralized. It was sitting in the water in dissolved state.
When you calculated your labile magnesium, you used bulk chemical analysis of the tailings. And so I understand that that was just a cheap alternative for doing Reactive analysis for brucite, right? So you can do the same thing, the same calculation by just monitoring how much brucite and bulk you have in the tailings.
And serpentine and fillers.
But the main supply of labile magnesium is brucite.
Yeah, I mean if you look at, on this plot, these are basically this end of the spectrum is brucite, and this big peak down here is essentially brucite free material. So it gives you a sense of what exists in the major minerals. But yeah, for this deposit, it's brucite. In some cases, it's hydrotalcite group minerals, which are common at Mount Keith, for example, and they have similar dissolution kinetics. But brucite is the most common one.
And the second question, you are now focusing more on Kimberlite tailings, or is it just because the companies would like to work with you, or is it your decision because you think in the future you'll be more effective if you work with Kimberlite rather than with neutral mines, for example?
So De Beers is by far our biggest sponsor right now. So the majority of our work is on De Beers mines, which by definition are diamond mines. So that's why we're working on diamond mines primarily. They have a lot of variability in labile magnesium. We haven't found tails like this yet, but they don't have the geochemical databases that a nickel company has, right? They don't run tens of thousands of major element analyses across the pipe. Looks like the Depswana does for some reason. Generally, those geochemical data don't exist, so we have to find other ways to generate, to get in, we're analyzing tens of samples per Kimberlite, not thousands. So how do we generate, the only way we're going to find these tails is by looking at this material. How are we going to get there is something that we're in the process of working on. So it's interesting that, the geochemical approach that we used at Baptiste, these data existed before we started working on them. These were all data that were collected purely to define the resource. We simply took advantage of, so they had zero cost from the perspective of our project. We haven't found that in Kimberlite. We're probably going to have to find a way to do a better job of mapping out that labile magnesium.
And in the real world, Greg, how do you get paid for that carbon sequestration? You're a company. Like you talk about, okay, I have this credit. Well, who gives you the money?
So in BC, you pay it when you fill your car with the car. And if you have a carbon sink, you get a rebate. So it is a check in the mail. So a mine will be paying the carbon tax on their diesel fuel. And as they put it in their trucks, they've already paid it. And if they have an offset, they'll get that reimbursed from that tax if there's a verification protocol. And then so it becomes a revenue stream because they're paying it up front. That's the way it works in BC. Every jurisdiction will be different.
How do I get reimbursed? My own life, do I have any sinks in my house that I should know about?
You may have sinks, I don't know if you have carbon sinks. I think in that outhouse you have that. There is a BC Climate Action Secretariat, and they're in control of what the verification protocols and how you can.
So just as you put this in practice and get verification, then you're potentially getting money back. You're basically paying for your gas. So
yeah, I mean here it's right now you're paying about 5 or 6 cents a liter when you're filling your car. 5 or 6 cents of that. So 6 of the $1.46 that you're paying right now is the carbon tax. You could get that back.
Last question. Is there an equivalent to lead or magnesium in the space called aluminium, manganese, iron, or calcium?
Not in common rock types that we've figured out yet.
Have you checked?
Well, I mean, so if it can't be in carbonate minerals, because then the best you'll do is break even. So calcium in a limestone is like, that's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
So if your calcium is in feldspar, you're controlled by feldspar dissolution kinetics. And they're not sheet silicates. They don't have the high surface areas that serpentine have. So clays are probably your best bet for that.
Yeah,
That's
like
the
that.
cation exchange. Yeah, we haven't. So any reason to believe that biotite would be any different from serpentine? It might. So it's well documented that brucite, so normally mineral dissolution rates, essentially they're proton activated, so the H plus comes in and essentially liberates magnesium off the mineral surface. Well established, there's a parallel dissolution mechanism for brucite that is bicarbonate activated. So HCO3 minus comes in and liberates that magnesium. The fact that we get labile magnesium measurements in serpentine, you can see those transient, suggests that same parallel dissolution mechanism operates in serpentine as well as in brucite, but that's not something that's established in the scientific literature. Not surprising, because serpentine has brucite layers, so the outer surface is a brucite, maybe it behaves like brucite. Not clear that those would operate in micas. I'm not aware of any studies that have shown that faster dissolution mechanism operates. Pardon me? Yeah, I mean, there's some people have looked at smectites and things like that for cation exchange for carbon sequestration. Nobody's really in a eureka moment. But most people, up until the tailings work, everyone talked about mineral carbonation as this stuff you were doing with olivine. Olivine's the most reactive, and you get 80% reaction in 20 minutes by going to 220 degrees, 200 bars, and it's a $200 per ton process. And this approach gives up on all of that reactivity. We get our reactivity through volume, not through efficiency. And so I don't think the clays have been, the work to date has tended to be looking at efficiency, how can we 50% out of it, because we're paying to put our material into a optimized reactor. We're not just sitting and letting things happen.
So I'm thinking of pottery copper.
Yeah.
Those are altered, hydrothermally altered feldspars.
Yeah. Yeah. The key is for clays normally, I think, for clays, here we're doing cation extraction. For clays, you're doing cation exchange.
Yeah.
So you need to put a cation in. Hopefully, you can put a cation in that doesn't like carbonate, liberate one that does. And then, if you're getting that by adding potassium chloride, then you've got to put the chlorine somewhere else because you don't want to make magnesium chloride. So you need to then also separate the anion from the cation when you precipitate. So it's the real nice thing about the ultramafics and using CO2 is your anion is the CO2, so you don't care if it combines with the cation. That's actually what you're after. So I'd say that, yeah, we haven't, because of those reasons, this is the best place to start, and we haven't mapped out yeah, Obviously, if you could get into porphyry space, the magnitude is significantly higher. We haven't made this work yet. At 1 million tons per year. Well, 40,000 tons per year isn't bad.
At one time you were talking about like grain size is important, so is there merit for a company to, would they buy into the idea of milling the waste product a bit more? Would that be a cost benefit, or is that too expensive to reduce grain size to make the reactions go faster?
So I'd say there's two answers to that. One is right now, when we're working with companies, the idea, we're working with Baptiste. They're looking at what's going to be the optimal metallurgical process, not only to liberate the nickel, but also to generate the CO2. So you're actually optimizing the process for 2 outcomes rather than 1. And so that would be the approach to take. In some instances, we actually want less grinding. So the great thing about Kimberlite is you have fine and coarse tailings. And if we want to push air through tailings, if it's all fine, you're going to spend a lot of energy trying to push air through fine tailings. But if you're blending it with coarse, you might actually get an optimal situation where you have permeability to gas and so still have the reactive surface area. Certainly what we've seen at Baptiste is the first big bulk sample. So the coarse fraction is more precise than the fine fraction. So you're not actually losing, you're not necessarily losing reactivity by focusing on coarse material. There's no clear correlation of partitioning of the reactive minerals into fines necessarily. So we might be trying to convince companies to grind less, not more. 60% recovery instead of 80% recovery.
Oh.
Right? You're going to lose, if you're doing grinding for nickel liberation, you're going to lose some nickel.
Good luck on that one.
What's the current situation with the verification protocol in Canada?
Yeah, so to our knowledge, nobody has done a verification protocol for tailings. But the BC Climate Action Secretariat is entertaining our proposal to put out a tender to do one. So there's one in process for green cement that has many of the same characteristics that tailings normally would, and we consulted on that one with the company that submitted it with the idea to give us a pathway to actually. So we're hoping we can convince the Climate Action Secretariat to put out a tender for a verification protocol. They typically spend like $50,000 on one of these things, and then a company comes in and does it. And then it goes out for comment. But we're hoping we can convince them to make BC the first jurisdiction to go with an actual verification protocol for tailings verification.
Are there any negative effects of having highly reactive tailings sitting around, like contamination and runoff or something?
Yeah, so I mean these ultramafic things are naturally alkaline, so they don't. Mount Keith is a sulfide nickel deposit, low grade, and there's the pH of their processed waters is 8.5. These are naturally alkaline, so there's no ARD risk. When they have leaks at the tailings storage facility at Mount Keith, they were killing trees because of the salting. They were using bore water, so they were half seawater salinity to start with, and they have high evaporation. So certainly the processed waters are not good, but then water use is strictly controlled, so they don't have a leakage entry. So I would say, our experience has been the primary risk is would be through water leakage. So we need to control that. And that's probably the only real risk for carbon leakage as well. So if you had, let's say you had acid rain fall and dissolve some carbonate minerals, well, you're not really going to get significant CO2 release unless those cations subsequently precipitate a sulfate mineral or something, right? You get gypsum or mag sulfate from where the magnesium or the calcium was originally in the CO2, you'll get some net emissions. But so if you can keep that water contained, keep track of it, that's how you monitor your CO2 leakage.
And is the capture of trace metals, you had a little thing on that, is that at a significant level with people who use that?
We've network of Jess Hamilton's is really just some of the first work that's been done. Ian Power did some leach columns on this scale and put native sulfur on the top, and it was going from pH 0.5 to 9 over this distance, and none of the metals were coming in the bottom. So that pH gradient was enough to, he was getting the magnesium at the bottom, basically he was getting magnesium sulfate, so that's essentially generating sulfuric acid, sulfur oxidizing bacteria in that system. So you're leaching magnesium sulfate, but not the other ones. But nobody's done large scale tests.
Yeah, but the stuff with Siobhan, that's the first order result is that carbonate mineralization transformation does not eliminate metals that are already there. So I mean, that could be a potential downside, right? If you have the reaction that every metal escapes the system, but it's not so, at least in that case, which is pretty cool.
If you separate your dissolution from your precipitation, so that's a replacement reaction. So you're doing your dissolution and precipitation all in one place.
Yeah.
If you want to extract the metals, and Sasha's working on this, can we actually extract nickel in a meaningful way from abandoned crystals by dissolving out these materials, separating the metals, and then crashing out the carbon? So you may actually, if you do want to produce the metals, you need to separate the dissolution and precipitation steps. That's sort of a two-stage system.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, as usual, we can take all unfinished discussion over to the Lennox Pub. We don't have a reservation today because there's a hockey game going on, but I'm sure we can all find a comfortable place to sit. So, yeah, join us at the Lennox Pub if you want to continue the discussion.